Hey, welcome back to Album Club. This is Bob Santelli of the GRAMMY Museum coming at you from a house on the Oregon coast, a friend's house where I've been kind of holed up for the last, I don't know, 6 or 7 weeks now. But having a great opportunity to listen to some of my favorite albums of all time. And that's what Album Club is basically a look back at some of the classic recordings of the last 60 or 70 years. For those of you who are here for the first time, it's like a book club, as I'm fond of saying, except we're not reading, we're listening to some of the best works that I can think of over the last 50 or 60 years, and discussing them in a way that allows for you to have a little bit more insight, a little bit more information regarding these records, which hopefully makes the listening to them a little bit more enjoyable and insightful. So we've talked about a 1980s album, Born in the USA. We talked about a 1970s album, Bob Marley and the Wailers' Catch a Fire. Today we're going into the 1960s. We're going to go back to 1968 and 1969 when Led Zeppelin released its very first album. Now, in order to understand the importance of Led Zeppelin, we got to move back a little bit in the decade and talk about the early 1960s when a lot of young people who would later on in the decade become superstars in rock and roll, were listening to American blues albums on their record players and phonographs in London and Liverpool and other parts of England, and really becoming fond of this great American music form. And I'm talking about people who would go on to make the Rolling Stones, like Mick Jagger, Brian Jones, Keith Richards. We're talking about Eric Clapton. We're talking about John Mayall. We're talking about a number of young British guitar players fascinated with the blues, the likes of Muddy Waters, Robert Johnson, and others, and begin to form bands that try to emulate or imitate what was happening in America, even though they'd never been to America, probably never even met an American musician, but they were very intent by playing a record over and over again to learn the rudiments of the blues. Well, one of the bands that formed back then, in addition to the Rolling Stones and others, was a band called the Yardbirds. The Yardbirds have a very important place in rock and roll history. Not only were they a great blues band, and then later on a very progressive pop rock band, but they also were responsible for three of the greatest guitar players of all time in the history of rock and roll. First, Eric Clapton, then Jeff Beck, and then Jimmy Page. Can you imagine that? A band with those three kind of players, not all together. It would be Eric Clapton first, and Eric would get so infatuated with the blues that when the Yardbirds started to veer off and delve into rock and roll with a song called For Your Love and few others that hit the record charts in the early 1960s. He was replaced by Jeff Beck. And then as we moved along in the 1960s, Jeff Beck decides to leave the Yardbirds and form his own group called the Jeff Beck Group. And then we would have Jimmy Page. At the time, for a short period, Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page played in the same version of the Yardbirds. Beck was playing guitar, and Jimmy Page, being a session player, played bass. When Jeff Beck left, then Jimmy Page moved over to lead guitar. But he wasn't there too long, because in 1968, the Yardbirds would break up. And it had created a really great catalog of music, but the personnel differences and the music was starting to change. Rock and roll was becoming rock, psychedelics were moving into the forefront. So it was an interesting time. We had bands like Cream and the Jimi Hendrix Experience exploding on the London music scene. But the Yardbirds were not able to kind of make the transition holistically. So the band breaks up. And the only person who really wants to carry on what the Yardbirds were doing was Jimmy Page. So what does he decide to do? He decides to, from the ashes of the Yardbirds, create a band called the New Yardbirds. Interestingly enough, the only member of the Yardbirds in the New Yardbirds was Jimmy Page. But he goes out and he gets a number of other players to play with him. And those, in essence, would become the first band of Led Zeppelin. You would have, of course, Jimmy Page on guitar. You had John Bonham, the great John Bonham, on drums. John Paul Jones was the bass player. And of course, Robert Plant the lead singer. It really was a power trio because there were only three instruments. It was kind of along the lines of the Jimi Hendrix Experience, a power trio, as well as Cream, another power trio, all three of which were coming out of the swinging London scene in the late 1960s. Jimmy Page, right from the very start of the new Yardbirds, inside of his soul and his brain, he has an idea of what these new Yardbirds should sound like. And he immediately puts the band together. New Yardbirds come on about August or so of 1968. Less than a month later, they're beginning a tour, a Scandinavian tour, as the New Yardbirds. They're going by the New Yardbirds because they had no other name. Until that is, as the story goes, Who drummer Keith Moon comes up with the term or the name Led Zeppelin because he thought in a joking way that they would go over like a lead balloon. I don't think he really meant that because anyone who heard the New Yardbirds knew that they were onto something. And for those people in Scandinavia, which is where the first tour, the only tour of the New Yardbirds actually happened, people who were at those shows were just absolutely blown away by the music that they heard and the synergy and the great connections that were being made between Plant and Page, and then the bottom section of John Paul Jones and John Bonham. So clearly they had a sound that was worthy of capturing on in the recording studio. Well, Jimmy Page takes them through this tour, and as soon as they come back, he has this vision that becomes each day more and more articulate. He begins to hear and see in his mind what it is that he wants to do. I don't think the other band members, none of whom were in any bands of the size and stature of the Yardbirds, where Page had come from, they were going along for the ride, but they too felt, based on early interviews with the band, they too felt that something very special was happening with this group. So what Jimmy Page does essentially is he books time in the studio in London, Olympic Studios, and that's where Led Zeppelin, #1, the first album, the debut album, would actually be recorded. Now, I don't want to get into the details of that quite yet. I'm going to give you a little bit of a homework assignment first. But before I do, try and place Led Zeppelin and the album Led Zeppelin into some sort of historical context. This is 1968, right? 1968, about a year past since Sgt. Pepper. There are bands coming out of England and the US just almost on a weekly basis that are really making some serious headway in terms of creativity and expanding what the definition of rock ought to be or actually became. So it was a very, very exciting time to put together a band and to go into a studio. Many of the bands that were forming in 66, 67, 68 out of England had this blues base. You know, Led Zeppelin, for all intents and purposes, starts off as a blues rock band. Fleetwood Mac, same thing, at the same time, a blues rock band. Pink Floyd starts out in a kind of blues rock band. The famous story with Pink Floyd, their name is based on two blues players, Pink Anderson and Floyd Council. They took the first names of each of those two Piedmont blues players and created the name Pink Floyd. So there's still a lot of connection to the blues. But what's going to happen in 1968, 69, 70, what you're going to see is an enlargement of what blues and rock could absolutely sound like. And so this is where it gets really, really interesting, not just with Led Zeppelin, but with all of these bands. But the one that will shine and the one that will have the most repercussions, not only in the late 1960s, but also into the 1970s, will be Led Zeppelin, of course. Some people feel like that first record is the first heavy metal album. And there's a case to be made. We'll talk about that next time we meet. But clearly, this is a seminal time in rock and roll history, an important band, an important album. What I'd like you to do for next week, sometimes I'll say, listen to this track or listen to that track. Not so in this case. I want you to listen to the entire album holistically. I want you to take it from top to bottom. And then we'll go through each of the songs and basically kind of point out what is exactly happening there. Because this record is going to be recorded in just incredible time, just amazing time for an incredibly cheap amount of money too. But there are certain things that I think you should look at. Pay attention to how Page and Plant in particular expand the definition of blues and incorporate it into something called blues rock. The other thing is pay attention to the guitar work of Jimmy Page, because Page's work here is revolutionary. In my view, as revolutionary as what Jimi Hendrix was doing on Are You Experience, and later on, of course, Electric Ladyland and Axis Bold as Love, 3 albums from this period. But Page, in my view, ranks right up there with Hendrix in terms of guitar innovation. So pay attention to that. And then the last thing I'd ask you to do is pay attention to what John Bonham and John Paul Jones are doing, because in a power trio, the role of the bass player and the drummer is vastly expanded. Okay, so you have a number of things to think about, a number of things to keep in the back of your mind. Listen to the record 2, 3, 4 times if you can, and then we'll come back next week and we'll discuss the details of what I consider to be one of the greatest albums of the 1960s, Led Zeppelin. Until then, happy listening, and I'll see you next week.